In this video we're going to focus on transforming our current template for our team selection page into a functional working page which we will then be able to use to select players for each specific fixture. If we go across to NetBeans, we can see that we have this sample template which we created in the very beginning. In it we have a form which has two sections. On the left we have the available players. We then have a bunch of buttons. We don't actually need a submit button. Because we can convert each of these into submit buttons. And then on the right we have a list of all of the players who are selected for that specific fixture. Every time we click one of these buttons, we're going to hopefully select a member on the left. If we click the right button, that member of the team will be removed from the list on the left and added to the list on the right. This list on the right will be basically the list of people who are selected for the fixture. And this detail will be stored in our fixture players table, while this detail will obviously be stored in our team players table. So the first thing that we do will be to build this into an actual template, which we'll then be able to expand upon later. And to do this, we're just going to first create a copy of one of these elements. The team profile page is one of the most straightforward ones, and so we can copy this one across. And we're just going to call it stretch team selection. We will need to rename the file inside of it. As well as changing the name of the elements within here as well. We're then going to need to call this template from within our selection page. And to do that, we can just copy some code across from one of our other templates. And specifically we're going to want the team selection page. We're then going to want to actually use this team selection. And we'll come back and populate it later on. For now we just want to get it set up and working. So if we go back across our browser and refresh, we should now see this section appearing as we would anticipate. This section is obviously still displaying as well because we still have it on our page, just for reference at the moment. The next thing that we're going to do is to transform this section, however, to display more like this section does. So first off we're going to have this title. We're going to have a section for the available players, a section for some buttons, and then a section for the selected players. So back within the team selection template, we're going to need to select the home team and the away team names. In order for us to show the fact that this is a fixture, as well as also making it clear for the manager of the team who they're actually playing in that specific fixture, in case they want to make different selections for different teams. Team name therefore needs to become home team name. In brackets we then have the date and time of the fixture. So we're going to need the fixture date and the fixture time, and they're going to be separated by an @ sign, which is exactly what we have here. The next thing that we can do is to remove this image logo, because we're not having a logo here anymore, we're going to instead go straight into a table. We're only going to have 2 separate rows in our table though, so we can delete a lot of this. In the first row, we're going to have available, and we'll put this inside of an H3 tag. So that it stands out from any other text. The next form field we're going to have is going to be empty. And then the third one, also within an H3 tag, is going to be selected. We're then going to have, as I say, the next row, and we're going to have 3 sections. In this first section we're going to have a select box with all of the available players listed. But then going to have this middle box which is going to be our 2 buttons. And then we're going to have our third box which is going to be all of the selected players. So for now I'm just going to move these pieces of information across directly. And then we will come back and customize them so that they actually work how we want them to later on. Onto the 2 buttons in this section. And then a final select box. So if we go ahead and delete this table, as well as the title which we already included, and we put the form outside of our custom element, and then go back across to our browser and refresh, we can see that we're going to get roughly what we would expect to see. We do have this still displaying however, so we can go back and delete this. And this is because we don't actually want the paper shadow displaying from our page itself. We want to create the paper shadow elements from within our template. So if we display it again, we can see that we have our table inside of our custom elements, and we have roughly the information that we're going to need. We obviously still need to pass this information across for it to display properly, which we will do soon, but the template itself is all in place. So the next thing that we can do is to work on our table. We obviously don't want this to be all squashed up as it is at the moment. We want this to be spread out across the entire template. And so we can create a new class in our style part called full table, or full width, that will do. And we're simply going to say width is equal to 100%, which we can then apply to our table. And by refreshing our page, we see that this is displayed properly. It is currently left aligned however, which is making it look strange, and so we can remove that class as well. Which makes it look a whole lot better. So if we go back across to our template again, and we can have a look at the options pane. If we delete all of these, so we're just working on one version of them, we're going to want to set the value, which will be something like player.playerID. We're also going to want to have the player's name, which will be something like player.playername. And I've specifically said player here because we're going to have multiple of them, and these are going to be within an array. And to do that, all we need to do is to create a new element here called template, which we're going to specify the repeat. which will be something like repeat the player for every player in home players, which will be an array which we pass across. And we're going to want to end that template just after our option, which will be the actual element which is repeated. And this should be available players, not home players. And so for our selected players, we're going to do the exact same thing, except we're going to change this to selected players. If we jump back across to our browser and refresh our page, we can see that we're not getting any elements at the moment, which is exactly what we'd expect because we haven't passed any data across. The next thing that we can do, however, is to work on these buttons. We did have these stacked vertically one on top of the other in our previous version, so we can go ahead and revert that behaviour. And all we need to do to achieve that is to wrap them inside of div tags. As you can see, if we refresh our page, they are now displaying properly. We did, however, have a space in between them previously, and so we can go ahead and put that space back in there simply by adding a BR. And refreshing our page adds that back into our page for us, and that just makes the buttons slightly easier to click. So now that we know which piece of information we're going to need inside of our template, we can go ahead and amend the header. We're not going to have a left line in our style, nor are we going to have a logo, so we can remove those. And we can also remove the clear fix, because we're not floating anything around our layout anymore. But as I say, we can go ahead and set up our attributes now. So we're going to have the home team name, the away team name, the fixture date and the fixture time, the available players, and the selected players. We don't need to worry about these yet. When we're creating our arrays later on, we will do. But for now, we obviously just need the information that's going to be passed across. So if we go back into our selection page, we can add these attributes in. So simply by copying and pasting them. We can just add some dummy information in there. Just to make sure that it's displaying properly. So we can create this example array, and we'll see if this works or not. As I say, this is just for testing anyway, so it doesn't really matter if it works or not. When we add our actual data in there, we'll be able to tell for sure. But if we go back across to our page and refresh, test 1 versus test 2, our data is displaying, but our time isn't, nor are our players. So we need to change fixture time to have an underscore instead of a dash, which will display the time correctly. I'm not worried about the fact that our players aren't displaying. That was obviously just a test, and it obviously didn't work. I obviously put something in the wrong order, but we'll find out exactly how this works later on. So the next stage will be to go ahead and actually populate all of this information with information from our database, rather than using this dummy data that I've added in here. To do that, we're going to go ahead to our team model, where we're going to need to create some new functions, as well as adding the information from the team model into our view in the controller. So the very first thing that we'll do is to create the link between the two, and we can copy this information across from our previous section, except we're going to call this team selection data and not just team data, just to make sure that we don't get confused. And we're also going to need to pass across our team alias, which we're going to get from our actual URL field. So within our view, we can use team selection data to replace the information that we've passed across. We're going to need to include this inside of PHP tags and echo it out. And the specific fields that we're going to call this will be the same name as the attributes that we're creating. And we could do this for the other fields as well. So instead of home team name, it should be away team name. We then have fixture date and fixture time. And then available players and selected players. We're then going to need to go ahead in our model and create this method, get team selection data, which takes the parameter of the team alias. As with all of our other methods, we're going to basically just call the stretch league version of the function, which is going to be specific to the database implementation. So we'll call this get team selection data. And we're not going to use this underscore team name, we're going to just pass across the team alias directly. And so if we go ahead and open up our stretch league controller, or library, sorry. We're going to create this method which is going to actually pass all of the data across to us from our database. In order for us to actually get all of the information that we're going to need, we're going to need to perform several select statements to get it all out of our database. So I'm just going to copy across the referee select statements just as a template. So we're going to store all of this data in a variable called data, which we will then later on return. The easiest place for us to retrieve most of our information will be from our fixtures view. For example, we can get the home team name, the away team name, fixture date, the fixture time, all from this one view. If you look across at our view itself, that's the vast majority of our information already taken care of. We will, however, still need to retrieve our available players and our selected players, and we will do that in a separate query. We are, however, going to want to filter this to occasions where the home team ID is equal to the team ID, or the away team ID is equal to the team ID. And this should be team ID with camel case, not underscores. And because we're only going to return one result, because we're limiting it by 1, we can add the 0 here, so only to return the first index. So if we go back across to our page and refresh, and this error is because we had fixture spelled wrong there. If we refresh again, we can see that we're getting this information out correctly. The date, however, is not in the format that we want it, so we can go ahead and change that as well. And so we can basically just copy this across from up here, which is in the format that we want it. Although that means that we need to use double quotes here and not single quotes. So if we refresh our page again, and we also need to add in our team number again, this is now in the correct format. So the next piece of information we're going to need is our available players, as well as our selected players. Now we're obviously going to need to create a duplicate select statement so that we can perform a second select action, this time to return all of the players who play for the team. We're going to store this within our data variable under team players. And the specific select statement that we're going to perform will be to select the player dot player ID as well as the player dot player name. We're going to select this from the player table, which is going to be adjoined with the team player table, and that's specifically going to be where the team player ID is equal to the player ID. And we're only going to want to return results where the team ID is equal to the team ID. We're not going to have home and away teams. And we're also not going to limit it to just one player. So just while we're testing, we can just var dump this. So if we go back across our page and refresh, we're going to see that we get all of the information that we originally had, as well as this team players section. And this is going to list all of the individual players who are playing for this team. So we're going to go one step further than this. And we're going to list out the selected players, which is going to be a very similar query, except we're going to use, instead of the team player, we're going to use fixture player. So if we go back across to our browser and refresh again, this time we're going to have all of our selected players included here. We are, however, going to have to filter this section so that we're only looking at the specific fixture that we're investigating at the moment, rather than all possible fixtures. And so we can feed in the fixture ID, which we will also need to return from here. So if we add the fixture ID to our first section, and we echo out the fixture ID from our data element. We're also going to need to specify that we're doing this for our first element. And so we can see that we have no players selected for this fixture. If you wanted to, you could of course do this for multiple fixtures, but we are going to limit this to just one fixture, even if there are multiple fixtures within the future week. So if we remove this var dump and die, and we go back across to our page and refresh again, we still obviously haven't got our information going into the right places, and so we can look at this in more detail now. We can now then begin to consider populating the templates which we've already created. In order to do that, we're first going to need to put this inside of 0, because we're going to return 0, not the elements directly associated with data. This means that when we return this, we're still going to be able to access the team players and the selected players. If we go back across and refresh our page, we can see that we're not actually getting any output yet, despite the fact that we have these elements names selected properly. The reason for this is because we're currently returning this data as an array, and we need to convert it into a string so that it can be accessed and passed across, just as we've done with other elements in the past. For example, when we were looking at the goal scorers, we encoded all of this into JavaScript and actually passed across this function so that we could decode it later on, which is exactly what we're going to do now. We're going to use this available players instead of goal scorers. And we're going to do the exact same thing for the selected players as well. So now that we're decoding them, we obviously need to go ahead and encode them. And we can use the exact same thing that we did when we were encoding them with our goal scorers as well. So in the selection page, we basically need to wrap this section. And if we copy this up across to our available players, we haven't actually created our available players index within our array yet. And so just for testing purposes, I'm just going to use team players. And so if we refresh our page, you can see that our available players are all listed here. We don't have any players selected for this fixture yet, which is why no fixtures or no players are displayed over here yet. But as I did say, this is currently listing all of the team players, whereas we only want to select the available players. In this case, because we don't have any selected players, it's correct that it's all of the players. But we want to actually, when we click the button, we want to remove the player from the available list, so that we can't add them again to the selected players accidentally. And in doing this, we will also create our available players index within our array. So to do that, I'm going to change this back to available players. And to do this, we're going to need to write some code. So instead of just returning this information straight away, we're going to process it. Specifically, we're going to need to check whether each element in our team player list is already in the selected list. If they aren't, we're going to include them in our available list, otherwise we're not. So we're going to need a for loop. So for each data team players as the key and value, we're going to loop through all of the elements in our selected players list. We're going to call this version K and V. If we find a match, we're going to go on to the next element, because we will have already included that player in our selected player. So we're going to look for matches. So if is equal to selected players we're going to set includes to false. And then after we've checked all of the possible entries in our selected players, we're going to have another if statement. If we're going to include it, array push and we're going to push into there this value, the data team players KV or key value. So let's go back across to our browser. In fact, before we try it out, we'll var dump this to make sure we can see exactly what's happening. So back in our browser, if we refresh our page, we'll transfer this into a normal for loop rather than a for each loop. And we can specifically look at the ID rather than the value. And we'll also convert this second for each loop into another for loop. Which means that we also need to adjust this. So if we try this again, we're getting less error messages now. And we're going to need to specify that this is going to be an array before we actually add any information to it. And if we refresh our page again, we can see that our information is passed across properly. Behind the scenes, I've added this player as being selected for our game, just so that we can actually test out that this is working properly, which it actually is now. So if we go back in and delete the var dump and the die, and then we go back and try to reload our page, we can see that all of the information is properly included. Torres in this case is showing as being selected but not available, which is the exact behaviour that we wanted. Because we're running long on time again now, in the next section we're going to actually work on dealing with inputting this data and updating our database. So we're basically going to have an input into our fixture player table as well as a delete from our fixture player table. And because we've linked this together now and created our available players array, this part will automatically update for us. So make sure you're subscribed so that you don't miss out, and refresh our page. We can add Matthews as a fixture player by clicking this button. So he is now removed from the list on the left and added to the list on the right. We can now remove our selected player of Torres, and he will then appear in the list on the left.